Hey everybody, right? Finally put out their patch 12.7 preview with full notes. Now, just as a forward, on the PBE, that is Riot doing experimental changes. They often do not happen. On their patch preview, which they put on Twitter, these happen. These are the official notes. This is what the balance team is saying is going to happen. The Yasuo and Yone buffs are going to happen. I don't think they should, and I think it's quite stupid, and I think even if they do, that they're doing it wrong. Basically, let's look back. Riot nerfed Shield Bow, they removed the Omnivamp rune, they nerfed the Lifesteal rune. Throughout all these things, Yasuo and Yone got nerfed, so Riot's going back and buffing them. Now, let's ask yourself, should Yasuo and Yone be buffed? Are they too weak? Be honest with yourself. After these nerfs, are these champions too weak? Write it in a note, leave a comment down below. Remember your opinion right now. Should Yasuo and Yone be buffed after all these nerfs? Even if you are being honest and even if you are being fair, Yasuo sits at a 49% win rate, Yone sits at a 49% win rate with the number 2 and number 9 win rate at Plat Plus. These champions are not weak right now. If we go to all ranks, we can see Yasuo has a 50% win rate, is the highest pick. Yone has a 50% win rate, is the third highest pick. Once again, these champions do not need to be buffed. The only argument I can see towards buffing them really is once we go to Masters Plus, we can see that despite holding the 10th and 12th highest pick, that their win rates aren't doing that amazing. Yasuo sitting at 46%, Yone sitting at 48%. However, once we look at the low ranks and we see up until Masters that they're doing absolutely fine, in fact quite excelling, that I'm not really sure where these buffs are coming from. The low sample size means that this could change very frequently, and I just don't really see, with this being your only argument towards buffing them a week after the changes, I don't really see that this needs to happen. To write this down here, Shield Bow got more HP, Lifesteal Rune got more HP. That means that these champions, despite having lower, let's call it highs, they can't sit in front of you in lifesteal as well, their lows being burst down and just not doing anything, that got much harder to do. It's harder to burst them because they have more shield and they have more HP. Particularly going forward, I really don't see why they're buffing both of them. I don't really see why they're not balancing them differently. Not only do we see that Yasuo excels more at the low ranks and falls off a bit at the high ranks, and we see Yone, counter-wise, he isn't that good at the low ranks, but still doing good. He's just not as good as Yasuo. He's still doing fine at the low ranks. He does a little bit better at the high ranks. I don't really see why they're trying to treat them like they're the same champion and balancing them as if they're the same champion. Wow, here I am editing this video, making it the best I can possible for you. You know, all I ask in return is that you like the video, leave a comment down below, and remember to subscribe to my channel. Yasuo and Yone have very large differences between them. One of them, Yasuo, is too good at the low ranks, and one of them, Yone, performs quite well at the higher ranks. What are those differences? And in addition to that, what actual balance issues have these champions been facing? To begin to describe the differences between Yasuo and Yone, I think we're going to go to my good friend Paint. Now, for those of you who know, obviously, Yasuo has a gap closer. He can gap close to anything, a minion, a champion, not wards, but for the most part, he can gap close to anything on the map. That means if, let's say, there are 3 minions in a row, and this is Yasuo, he can gap close to here, then gap close to here, then gap close to here. Everybody gets that, right? Here's the obvious downside. He can't gap close to here because there's no minions. This means the threat range, let's call it, of Yasuo is somewhere around here. The threat range is contained. Once you know that Yasuo can really only gap close to these minions, then you know this is his threat range. That gives him an observable weakness, something you can see about this champion, something you can counter. In addition to that, if we look through it, if Yasuo gap closes to here and gets stunned, he doesn't gap close to there. In fact, it should be more like he can get stunned here. If Yasuo gets stunned in the middle of his gap close, it just stops. It doesn't move any farther. This is unique to Yasuo. Yone doesn't actually have these weaknesses. Describing Yone now and why it's kind of absurd to try to balance these champions if they're similar. If this is Yone, where is his threat range? Well, it's this. It's everything. Why? Because Yone's E, that's where he dashes into his little spirit dash, can just be used anywhere. In addition to that, it is a ramping movement speed buff during it. Yone gets bonus movement speed when he's in his little spirit form. He gets 10% to 30% bonus movement speed. That's not a small amount. That means he can gap close forward and then chase you down. In addition, Yone's Q is also a gap closer. so he has 2 gap closers, but his ult is also a gap closer. I'm telling you guys all this because you've likely experienced this. Yone killing you from 2 screens away for free. Yasuo can't do anything like that. He can use his ultimate to get close to someone who knocks you up, but he can't himself just gap close into a gap close into a gap close, all while over a movement speed buff. It's just absurd to me that they're trying to pretend that these champions are similar when in reality Yasuo has clear actual threat ranges and things you can do to try to avoid him. Trying to avoid Yone is you can either stat check him or you can try to hide under a turret, but even if you hide under a turret he does so much damage. Here's something you guys probably don't know either. His ultimate is also immune to CC doing it, so he can always get that ultimate CC off. Yasuo, if his gap closer on his E gets interrupted by stun, it cancels. Yone's E also is immune to knockups. So he has 2 different forms of gap closers that cannot be avoided. You can't stun him out of it. If you're trying to play Annie or if you're trying to play Vex, he will just go directly through them. And here's the best part, they're both immune to CC. His E will go off through CC. His ultimate will go off through CC. Now you can make the argument, once again, oh, it's fine. His ultimate is like that. It's like Shyvana's or Malphite's ultimate. Those are both immune to CC, right? But the issue here is that when you have a normal ability that's immune to CC, then you have an ultimate ability that's immune to CC, particularly once you factor in his 3rd gap closer, once you factor in his movement speed buff, he kind of just force stat checks so many different champions, and it's really dumb and unfun. And in a lot of ways, again, when you factor in his threat ranges like that, it really paints a different picture from Yasuo, doesn't it? So Yasuo and Yone are not the same champion. Unfortunately, their items did get nerfed, supposedly, and so they're getting buffed. Here's the issue with that line of thought as well. Do we see in this list any other champion being buffed because Lifesteal got nerfed? Well, no, actually. The only other AD carry here being buffed is Kalista, who's being buffed totally unrelated to these changes. So clearly, in combination with when we look at Yasuo and we can see every time items get adjusted, here's a champion who's actually been relatively balanced for a while, and look here, we can see that this champion is getting buffed and changed and nerfed and changed and buffed all the time. Yasuo and Yone are clearly way too dependent on lifesteal, and they're way too dependent on items like shield bow for their itemization. Is that Riot's fault? Could they have done more? Yes, actually. Yes, they could have done more. And in fact, I'll show you several examples up here. When we look at Samira, we can see a champion that once, like Yasuo and Yone, was way too dependent on lifesteal, way too dependent on shield bow. So what did Riot do? Did they just nerf Samira into the ground and say, well guys, she's dependent on them, so that's the end of it, that's all we can do? No, actually, you can see right here, lifesteal is only 66.6% effective on Samira's flare, her Q. They went in and they said, Samira scales too well on lifesteal, we're nerfing lifesteal on her Q. But then they said, lifesteal's too effective on her ultimate, so actually we're just gonna have to nerf her entire champion. Well, no, they didn't do that either. Then they went to her ultimate and they said, you know what guys, lifesteal's way too effective on her ultimate, let's nerf on her ultimate too. So we have a clear example here of a champion who scales too well on lifesteal, who actually gets addressed to not scale too well in lifesteal. Unlike Yasuo and Yone, who've been nerfed and buffed all the time because they scale too well in lifesteal, so when lifesteal is too good, they're overpowered, and when it's bad, they get buffed. Instead of that, they went through and actually addressed the issue. But you might be saying, okay, well that's fine, but they scaled too well on shield bow, Hashinshin, so obviously there wasn't too much we could do about balancing them on that shield, right? They scaled too well on that item. Well, no, and once again, we have 2 examples of that. Aatrox scaled too well on Gore Drinker. So what did they do? They nerfed his healing amplification, but buffed his self-healing. This meant that Aatrox heals more based on his own kit, but heals less on items, making him less item dependent, more free to choose different items. That's a good change. For the health of the champion and for the long term of his all that stuff, wow, this was good for Aatrox. But you're saying, okay, fine. It was only Samira, it was only Aatrox, and okay, also Olaf. Fine, so 3 champions. 3 champions have had their effects addressed. We can see Olaf's healing amplification was reduced to 0 to 33% from 0 to 50%. But his lifesteal on his own kit, once again, like Aatrox, was increased. So less healing from items and effects, more healing from himself. So we can see one champion gets less lifesteal on her effects, another champion gets his kit adjusted, another champion gets his own kit adjusted. We can see 3 different champions getting adjusted to make them healthier for the long term of the game. But do Yasuo and Yone get that? No, they don't get that at all, which is just stupid to me. This is just stupid. They've done these changes. Why don't they apply this logic into Yasuo and Yone? Then we wouldn't need to be here every 2 weeks reading another patch, another adjustment to these champions. They wouldn't be needing 4 changes a season, because every time the wind shifts slightly, oh, they're underpowered, now they're overpowered. To show how coding abilities in a unique way can make a champion more balanced, here is Samira. Her Q is ranged. It does not proc trinities on hit. It gives lifesteal. It gives less lifesteal. This makes Samira a far more balanced champion, particularly because proccing trinities on hit from very long range would make you very difficult to balance. Now let's compare this to Yasuo, and by extension Yone, but for now just Yasuo. Yasuo's Q applies full lifesteal every hit, even at range. There's no penalty to his lifesteal whatsoever. Despite the fact that it's an AoE, it actually counts as single target, but it's been jankily coded to where it only counts as single target, but can only lifesteal off one enemy. For those who don't know, any AoE effect gets 33.3% of your healing. That means that Yasuo's Q should get a 66.6% penalty. To try to balance it and make sure that Yasuo didn't heal to full off a couple minions, they made it only lifesteal off the first enemy, but lifesteal for full, which means that in most teamfight situations, it's getting far more lifesteal than any AoE ability ever would. Now, you can question the balance of making AoEs get 66% less lifesteal and all that. You can question that, that's fine, but the point is that Yasuo has actually had janky coding onto his Q to ensure that it does get full lifesteal. It gets more lifesteal than other champions' abilities would. You can say, once again, that's fair, but clearly this champion, through these effects, has actually been way too balanced on lifesteal, and the effect, the dependency on lifesteal should have been broken a long time ago. My argument now is that Yasuo and Yone just get way too much of their kit as lifesteal. Way too much of their damage is lifestealable. Average champions don't have the vast majority of their kit lifestealable. I'm going to compare them to 3 different champions, and let's look through them. First off, let's look at Yasuo. The vast overwhelming majority of its damage on Yasuo and Yone is going to come through their passive, giving them full crit and bonus damage, and their Qs being a spammable nuke. Because I've shown how their Qs work, they get way too much lifesteal on their Qs, and with their other abilities not doing nearly as much damage as their auto attacks and their Qs, it just shows that way too much of their kit is lifestealable. Now we're going to compare that to Jax, Irelia, and Master Yi. 3 champions who often have a lot of drain tanking, 3 champions who often heal a lot, but they've never quite reached the level of just straight up not taking damage because they're just healing through everything. While champions like Master Yi can sometimes get there, it has not been nearly as bad an issue as Yasuo. So let's look through Jax. When we look at Jax's kit, his passive gives him attack speed. All his passive gets lifesteal, right? Because he just attacks a lot. His Q doesn't get lifesteal. His W on hit doesn't get lifesteal. His counter-strike, no lifesteal. His ultimate on hit, no lifesteal. The only thing he lifesteals is straight up his passive. Let's look at Irelia. Despite Irelia often being an issue because of her Q on minions, once she's fighting champions, how much is she healing? Does her flaws do it lifesteal? No. Does her ultimate lifesteal? No. Does her passive on hit damage lifesteal? Also, no. The only thing that lifesteals is her base damage and her Qs. Let's look at Master Yi. He gets lifesteal on his double hits from his passive, but he doesn't get lifesteal on Apple Strike. He only gets healing on Meditate from the healing. I mean, he doesn't like lifesteal anything. He doesn't get lifesteal from Wuju Styles on hit true damage, and I guess his ultimate gives him attack speed that he can lifesteal on. None of these are comparable to Yasuo and Yone. They, compared to other champions, just lifesteal far more. It's like as a percentage of their total damage that they lifesteal, it's just far more than other champions. This just leads to situations where, yeah, Yasuo and Yone are just attached to lifesteal because they just get too much of it enabled into their kits. So after saying all of that, let's look at these changes. What would I do differently? Well, what are they doing? Yasuo is getting more base HP, and his R cooldown is going down in the early game. Yone's ult cooldown is going down in the late game. These aren't the most fundamentally stupid changes. These aren't changes that just make me go, ah, and just go, you're the dumbest people ever. You might notice I've been fairly reserved throughout this video because they're on track, they're just not being smart enough. They're not going far enough, and let me explain why. These changes, will help. They will certainly address some issues, but they're not really doing long-term game health, which I believe is what they should be doing. Let's look at this. Late game is more focused on the low ranks, early game is more focused on the high ranks. So when we compared this to Yasuo and Yone, Yasuo was doing better at the low ranks, worse at the high ranks. Most of his buffs are based on the early game. 30 more health, his ult cooldown going down early game. Yone was the opposite. He was doing better at the high ranks and worse at the low ranks. So his buffs are focused more on the late game. These buffs don't really do anything, and if I'm gonna be honest, I feel like the Yasuo one is a bit way more impactful than the other one. So let me go through nerfs I would do to actually try to get their kit into a more healthy position. Make their Qs only get 66.6% of lifesteal. Lifesteal's basically been nerfed into the ground at this point. It's practically unnoticeable. In order to get your lifesteal to any amount that would be noticeable, you need to stack like 3 sources of it. That's not really healthy for the game, that you need to stack the ever-living crap out of lifesteal just to kind of notice you have lifesteal, and even then it just gets healing debuffed. That's not good gameplay, that's unsatisfying for everyone, and it's that way simply because Yone and Yasuo just get too much lifesteal. For Yasuo in particular, I would make his ultimate lose bonus penetration. That is a hard nerf towards his late game, and it's a hard nerf particularly towards what he's excelling too well against. He's excelling too well at just sort of removing everyone's armor, removing everyone's counterplay against him, and just destroying tanks. Tanks are weak enough already. As for Yone, I would remove the bonus movement speed during his E. He's got 3 different gap closers. He doesn't need a permanent movement speed buff in addition to that, so that even if you dodge his Qs, even if you dodge his ultimate, he can just run you down and auto attack you anyway. If you do these nerfs, you'll get these champions into a far more balanceable position that's better for the game. From there, you can actually start buffing things. Maybe you can buff Yasuo's early game. Maybe you can give him more health regen. Maybe you can give Yone more health regen. Maybe you can give Yone some ability to deal with early ganks. I don't know. So long as you actually deal with what makes them horribly imbalanced, what makes them just such a disaster on the game, once you address these issues, you can start going into these champions and making them healthier. That's my opinion, and I think that would make the game significantly better. These buffs are fine. I don't really hate them. I think the Yasuo one goes a bit too far and will definitely make him way overpowered at the low ranks, because in particular that health buff, remember, they lowered his health because they buffed his shield. The whole point was you could poke off his shield and then burst him. Well, now he's getting better health, so he retains that big shield, but now he's still got the health, and you know, it's but yeah, I think that these changes, look, they would obviously need buffs after this. I'm not suggesting we just nerf them into the ground. I'm suggesting let's do some things that actually makes this game healthier for these champions who show up 5 to 6 times per season in the notes. They're some of the most adjusted champions ever. You touch a crit item, a lifesteal item, and suddenly there's 5 Yasuo changes in the patch notes. Let's go through, let's actually address these champions. Maybe once we do that, we can buff lifesteal back up. Wow, congratulations, you reached this late in the video. The reason I wasn't being that mean, I guess, is because I don't fundamentally disagree with what they're doing here. They're trying to do what they should do with these champions, I guess. It's just stupid the way they're going about it. With the Darius and Jack stuff, it was really dumb, and as we've seen with the Darius changes, they have definitely not ended in a good way and have made that champion way more frustrating, and I'll be making a video on that later. I'll probably go through more of these champions tomorrow or the days after, but if I make one long video, people won't watch it, and if I make many videos, people will probably watch shorter, more balanceable videos, and I can put more attention into individual champions on them. So that's what I intend to do. So as for everyone else, I hope you enjoyed this video. You can leave a comment if you agree or disagree with anything or anything like that. If you want to hate me, yell at me, whatever, it's fine. It's user engagement. Go ahead for it, buddy. And at the end, I want to say thank you to my Patreon supporters. You guys and the YouTube members continue to support this channel and make it a lot. My Patreon has been going down in members lately, probably because I haven't been shilling for it as much. So if you want to, you can go down to the link in the description and you can join my Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you can continue to support me and this channel and make longer, more in-depth, more edited videos like this, more financially responsible to do. So thank you if you do that. Special thank you to everyone who merely likes the channel. You guys are great. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye, everybody.